Welcome, everybody. That's loud. Welcome, everyone. Come on in and take a seat. We're going to go ahead and get started. A couple quick notes briefly, since this is the last time I'll be on a microphone this evening. I want to give quick and repetitive thank yous to two particular people in addition to a lot of other people. Yusuf Farhad, who hopefully you've had the opportunity to meet, has been indispensable to the program, and Paula Sedaris, who commands the event services. If you see either Paula or Yusuf, be sure to give them a big hug or a high five, because they really deserve all of it for the work they put in. So thanks to them. And one brief housekeeping note, I guess. After we're done here, if you'll be joining us for the evening at the art gallery reception, there will be a shuttle out front. If you'll be driving, the address is on that big postcard you got with your programs, the one in the many Art and Human Rights. It's not very far, the building, so that's in case you'll be driving. Parking is easy down there too. Okay. Welcome everyone to our final session of the afternoon that addresses the role of media and communications technology in 21st century global human rights advocacy. My name is Joel Pruce. I am a postdoctoral fellow in human rights studies here at the University of Dayton, and it is my distinct honor to serve as moderator on this expert panel. With a sweeping subject such as ours, we intend to at once penetrate down to the foundation of human rights advocacy, as well as project into the future how the practice of advocacy can and will change with continued technological advancement. Information and the transmission of information are at the heart of human rights promotion. Gathering witness testimony and collecting forensic evidence in the aftermath of a massacre, for instance, are crucial for our ability to determine murky truths out of complex crises and to recreate the past through the construction of narratives and through storytelling. What happened, to whom, why, and at whose hand? Exposing abuse and unmasking perpetrators are also key expressions of an information politics that seeks to make secrecy impossible, because secrecy, that is the lack of transparent information, breeds impunity. Better to shine a light than curse the darkness, proclaims Amnesty International's founding motto. So we use media and communications technology as tools to tell stories, expose truths, and shame abusers into compliance. Now, the context of 21st century global human rights advocacy, as transmitted through 21st century global media technology, provokes a new layer of questions. We speak of witnessing in terms of a first-hand account given by the medical caregiver in a conflict zone in the model of Doctors Without Borders. We also speak of witnessing in the model of the organization Witness, providing activists with documentation tools and injecting accountability and moral force into asymmetrical struggles. Still, it is yet another matter to conceptualize media and communications as a fluid, social environment in which an audience can witness atrocities at a distance and therefore bear some ambiguous moral obligation for the suffering of the individual pictured in the newspaper, on television, or on the internet. And if we do understand media in this way, then the question of social practice is how do we transform spectatorship into action, avoiding the pitfalls of staring and gawking like passersby at a car crash, while respecting the dignity of the subject in frame. A final layer of the human rights advocacy landscape is the way in which NGOs position themselves with brand recognition and visibility that utilizes mass media both as a means to an end as well as an end into itself. The presumption that, for instance, Facebook friends and Twitter followers translates into fundraising dollars, letters to the editor, or other indicators of public engagement is a tenuous argument on which NGO decision-making rests. Posturing and jockeying for attention in a competitive environment compels human rights actors to feature themselves as the worthy recipient objects of charitable appeals, as well as the indispensable subjects of political action. This dynamic forces us to critically examine the optics of human rights advocacy and how it shapes the content of campaigns and the strategies of major NGOs, the vulnerable groups on whose behalf they speak, and the social movements with whom they partner. The practice of human rights today is not confined to legal documents or diplomatic overtures. Human rights today is cultural, it is textual, it is visual. And so one of our tasks today on this panel is to bridge that conceptual framework with the operations of human rights and humanitarian organizations. And to help us dissect these issues, I'm pleased to welcome a distinguished panel to the University of Dayton and to this conference. We'll proceed in order from my right to, well, from my left, yes. Dr. Alison Brysk. Yes. Dr. Alison Brysk is Mellichamp Professor of Global Governance at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and the author most recently of Speaking Rights to Power, a new volume just released by Oxford University Press that provides a long view of the communications efforts by human rights movements that seek to mobilize political will. Leora Kahn is the founder and executive director of Pruce, Media for Social Justice, an organization devoted to visual storytelling for genocide prevention and peace building. Leora is a photographer and documentary filmmaker whose work has been featured in Time Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and the New Yorker. Anna Jeffries is a reporter and editor of the West Africa Bureau of IRIN, the news agency of the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Anna covers humanitarian and human rights issues focused on Mali, Nigeria, and the Sahel. And prior to being with IRIN, Anna worked on children's rights and conflict for Save the Children. Sam Gregory is program director at Witness. As part of his work at Witness, Sam has edited a volume on media advocacy, produced multiple advocacy videos, and has been recognized for his expertise in emerging forms of media advocacy. Recently, Sam has explored the way in which immersive technologies like Google Glass can be used to foster global solidarity. And Jason Kahn is the Director of Communications for Doctors Without Borders. In this role, Jason oversees crisis and advocacy communications for MSF USA. As well, Jason worked as executive producer on Starved for Attention, an Emmy-nominated documentary series on childhood malnutrition. So we'll proceed in the order in which I've introduced everyone. Because of the nature of the work of our speakers and the topic generally, there will be a visual component. The speakers also have promised each to sing and dance and clap a little bit to be sure that we're all awake at this hour after 2 long days. See? There you go, living up to our promises. Maybe, okay, there you go. Right? Yoga poses, whatever's going to do it for you over the next hour and 15 minutes, you're welcome to. Okay. So, that all being said, Alison Brysk, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I will take 30 seconds of my allocated time to thank and appreciate Joel's role in organizing the conference and this panel and this dialogue, which I think is tremendously useful. Mark and Sulaco, somewhere out there, for the larger project of the center, and all of you for being here, and all of the scholars and practitioners who are engaged in this really constructive exercise of learning from each other and building a research and advocacy community. So, thank you. And I speak on behalf of all my fellow panelists here in the closing hours. So as Joel has just mentioned, and I have spoken to probably half of the people here, I have just completed this book, Speaking Rights to Power, with Oxford University Press, and it draws upon over 20 years of my own research and engaged scholarship and observation that I hope informs practice of human rights campaigns on 5 continents on a whole variety of issues, ranging from my own earliest work in Latin America with transitional justice and the Mothers of the Disappeared, onward through indigenous rights struggles and the globalization of indigenous rights struggles, through private wrongs, human trafficking, health rights, and beyond. And so I tried also to draw upon comparisons with other people's work and really come up with a communicative action theory of human rights campaigns. And so my role here right now is to reflect upon what my framework that I've come up with that I think helps us to think about this has to say specifically about media and the role of media. So in my framework, I'll give you 2 sentences on the overall framework. I believe that human rights campaigns and indeed all kinds of social change and transformative efforts are based in a narrative structure, narrative appeals, and that we can fruitfully analyze those appeals through the narrative arc of voice, frame, performance, media, and audience. And so one of the comments I will make later on is that, which means in 3 minutes, don't panic, when people say, and later I'll and it's like 4:30. I know, I'm a professor, I know this look. You know, one of the things that we need to think, one of the first things we need to think about media is that it is embedded in a larger communicative and narrative process. We cannot separate the media from the message and many associated dimensions of that message. And when we see media efforts, to preview what I'm about to say in a more systematic way, when we see media efforts that are really misbegotten or lacking or distorted, i.e. Kony 2012, which I profile as a negative case in my media chapter. I look at Iran, I look at China, I look at a lot of interesting things that I think are promising, and then I look at Kony 2012 because, you know, social scientists, right? We're supposed to have negative cases, compare and contrast. It's when they are disembedded from the narrative arc and from the larger communication process. Media is not a substitute for message. You know, Pache Marshall McLuhan, you know, rest in peace. Okay, so Joel asked us to answer 3 questions, or that's sort of my job here. How do media and communication technology transform and support advocacy? What are some of the obstacles and limits? And what is overlooked? How do media and communications technology transform and support advocacy? Well, all forms of media, not just new media, but all forms, in some fashion, either and or help to introduce new voices, help to persuade through the classic information politics technique, and or help to mobilize. These are the things we want media to do. How do they do it? First of all, through diffusion of information, which is something that both old and new media do. Second of all, by witness credibility and expertise. Third, by creating a venue for the performance of human rights narratives, scripts, claims, and campaigns. And that, again, is something that old and new media do, but that new media and social media have a particular advantage in the immediacy with which they do that. And the fourth thing, which is relatively stronger for new media, is interactivity and the creation of a new public sphere in which direct interactivity in real time is possible. Radio call-in shows have a little bit at the lower end of the technological spectrum, but okay. So that's sort of what they do, how they do it, and that's, I think, I hope, a useful framework for assessing how different forms of media play that role along the narrative arc of the human rights campaign messaging. Obstacles and limits, 3. The first one is the digital divide, which we really haven't talked about yet. You know, so access to different forms of media is very much limited by geographic location, by class and economic placement, by gender, by educational level, and all sorts of other things. Second, state control. And again, we've talked a little bit about surveillance, but we haven't really talked about, the Great Firewall of China and those sorts of state-based efforts to manipulate and control access to media. I think some of our practitioners will be weighing in on that question shortly. So the constant kind of cat and mouse game of coming up with ways to evade and transcend state attempts to control access to media and the defense of access to media as a human right. And third, that need to place media, use of media, in an appropriate and relevant use of the total arc of communication politics. Voice, frame, you have to have the right people or the right voices saying the right things based on the right information. I mean, this again is Coney 2012. You sort of can check the boxes of how they were wrong in all these ways. Using the right genre of performance and targeting the right audience. 2 minutes. Which brings me to my last question. What is often overlooked? What is something new or different that we should be thinking about? So in the chapter on audience, I try to think about this question of, is there such a thing as world public opinion? I don't think so. I think that there are messages that are targeted implicitly or explicitly to different sectors and segments. We're trying to reach different kinds of people, and we're going to do a much better job if we think more consciously about who we're trying to reach. Is it voters, elites, coalition partners, people from one cultural background, etc. Okay? And the key in my analysis to reaching the right people is to understand who they are and then to have a bridging narrative, to be able to frame your campaign, your struggle in terms of a rubric of a human rights violation. Are we talking about genocide? Are we talking about illicit detention? Are we talking about the rights of women? To label, to brand, and to tell a story that reaches people who are receptive to that story and who are going to lend their ear and then their voice and then their efforts to your struggle because you've got a good narrative fit. That's my take on things, and I will be very anxious to hear how the experience of these practitioners who work in ways that I very much admire and learn from fit into this kind of framework on media. Thank you. It was 11 minutes.
How do we do this?
Can we queue up? There
Okay,
it is.
so that's proof. So just, thank you. I'm not going to go into thank yous. We've already done it. And I hope everybody's awake. So just a correction, I am not a photographer. I'm a horrible photographer. So I did not do photographs for Rolling Stone. I'm a former photo editor. And that's how I came to what I'm doing. A photographer and myself, a photojournalist and myself, founded Proof. And Proof is one of those small NGOs that Louie and Leora were talking about, that are a human rights NGO. And so just a little bit about Proof is we use, and Alison's going to be able to see if it sort of fits right into your sort of framework. We use photography and personal testimonies of people who have either been victims of human rights abuses or upstanders, and those people that have rescued others from human rights abuses. And so one of our goals is, and we've talked a lot about this in this conference and about education, is to get people, students, young people, to talk about moral courage and about human rights, and what it takes to be part of the solution instead of the problem. And we do this through personal storytelling, and we disseminate it through photography exhibits. Let's see if this works. This is a photographer, not the one that I worked with, my partner, but we do it with photography exhibits and interactive workshops and conferences. We also do this specifically with local partners. And we also work with international organizations like the ICC, the UN, et cetera. And we do this because we want to inspire, our goal, again, is to inspire more young people, college students, high school students, to stand up against injustice that they see in their own communities. So we look at technology, is more than social media. For example, there's technology that can track issues as they emerge, but there's a difference between engaging around the stories and understanding where these stories are emerging. For example, you can look at trolling for mentions for special keywords, and that's really about pure technology. And there's been broad discussions, which other people will probably talk about more social media, but proof is not just about social media as far as using it as an advocacy tool. I mean, in the classic sense, advocacy is, and we've talked about this here, it can be used as a propaganda channel, positively or negatively, and it's used to engage people, to ask people how to act. So Proof's aim is to use technology to help the communities get closer to the issues in order to engage. And we engage the community to act on these issues while building capacity. And so it's more sort of broader than specific than social media. So how do we do this? I don't remember when I started. I'm going to talk about 2 case studies. Proof, along with a partner, a local partner in Rwanda, wanted to work with youth and general public to see in themselves for these examples show an inconvenient truth, that not all Hutus were killers during the 1990 genocide. This picture shows a person that his whole community actually rescued Tutsis during the 1994 genocide. So, how do you communicate this? And you talked about, what access to like Twitter and Facebook. You can't do that in Rwanda, in rural areas in Rwanda. They, at this point when we were doing this project, and still today, they didn't have access. Some people don't have access to computers. They don't have access to Twitter. So how do you do it? So we took the testimonies and their photographs, and we created an exhibit about these people. So they didn't fight over the narratives that are in textbooks. They see real people, and they're not politicized. So they're real stories, like this guy, this pastor, saved over 300 people in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide. And they're real people. They could be your father, you could be your teacher, the farmer next to you, etc. So the example of Rwanda, they're growing up in a society where it's riven by genocide, and this is a chance for people to really see themselves that using this form of communication to transform their opinion of the other, the bad Hutu. These exhibits traveled to high schools in Rwanda, and they're not, you can see, they're very what I call down and dirty exhibits. You wrap them up, you put them in a truck, they can go anywhere, they can be outside in a village. It's not high art, they're not in museums, they're very public. And again, it's not Facebook or Twitter, but it's a form of visual storytelling that, unlike us, audiences with affluence that have lots of devices, like Sam has on his head, there's no computers, there's no tablets. The average person, and this is really important for Proof's work, the average person has access to these stories. So this was replicated, whoops, why is it going backwards? Oh, this was replicated in Bosnia and in Cambodia. These are all rescuers that we interviewed in Sri Lanka. And it was really embraced, and some were more, some of these projects were more successful than others. Specifically in Cambodia, they completely took this on themselves. We had created one form of an exhibit, and then they had the whole town participate in recreating the exhibit. And a lot of, when we did the trainings, because these exhibitions go with trainings and workshops and sometimes conferences, the really successful part of in Cambodia was a group of students asked to be trained as trainers so that they could go back to their communities and teach about moral courage in the communities. So it's very effective to have the testimonies, and they also wanted to have all different kinds of rescuers from the different countries. So the other project that we did was on the legacy of rape, and this is one we're working on right now. And we were asked, in one case study we were asked by, we worked with OSF and the American Bar Association to take these testimonies to the DRC. The American Bar Association is working with victims or survivors of rape, and they have rape trials. So what we did was, and you can't see it so well, but we had sort of life-size, pictures with this testimonies in Swahili and in French. And these are women that are going to be prepped to go into testifying at the rape trials, which is really, really hard. And so by giving them courage to be able to testify. And that's what the American Bar Association and OSF and I, the ABA is in East Kivu. So that's another example. So the question was, what crucial ideas often overlooked? So in my experience in running Proof and working with human rights advocacy, the important thing that we feel is visual storytelling and not the technology. I mean, we call our, photographs technology, but that's important. And what are the persistent obstacles that what doesn't engage, what messages work and what doesn't work, how do you frame the messages? Some of the technology lets us test more quickly than we used to, and Proof's approach, and others are struggling. And some of the challenges that we have in working in communities that might not have technology, we think about interactions, communities and interactions. So what we look at is not us leading, but for example in Rwanda, Rwandans leading Rwandans. So we don't go there and do this with them. We go together and do it. They either come to us with an idea, the communities in post-conflict, or, so those are some of the struggles. And then how do we communicate? We communicate, the struggles are how do you communicate, Rwanda and the rest of the world. And how do we overcome these obstacles? We really want to use the community stories and not ours, and we feel that's really, really important. Our stories don't matter, their stories matter. Thank you.
Anna. Wait for them to...
Okay. Okay, there we are. So I am with IRIN. Some people call us IRIN. I don't know how many people in this room have ever used IRIN or are familiar with it. I imagine some of you are. But we are a editorially independent project of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA. So we're part of OCHA and we're funded by them, but we really are distinct and kind of see ourselves as separate and independent. Otherwise, we wouldn't be editorially credible. Just to give a bit of background, we're present in Southern Africa, the Horn and the Great Lakes. We're in West Africa, which is where I'm based, Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And our audience is made up primarily of humanitarian workers, but also of analysts, academics, researchers, military and governments, etc. And we have about 300,000 subscribers. We are set up, linking to the Rwandan genocide, we were set up after the Rwandan genocide in 1995 to fill a gap of humanitarian reporting, a quality humanitarian reporting that was seen to be a big problem in that disaster, that crisis. So how do we interact with human rights advocacy? Well, we're humanitarian, so we come at it very much from the rights-based perspective to humanitarian aid. So, the issues that we might cover are the rights of Somali refugees to clean water and sanitation, the rights of Malian pastoralists to a sustainable livelihood, the rights of children in northeastern Nigeria who are faced with Boko Haram attacks to attend school, the rights of Mauritanian domestic workers to a living wage. So it's very broad, and our approach is very broad. our reporting aims to be human-centered and respectful, and we too take a social justice approach. We try to convey, rather than setting up the frame of desperate person in crisis meets the aid agency saviors. We try to really relay how people are building up their own, these communities are building up their own resilience, and whilst living in some of the toughest conditions in the world. So we try to really convey and work with people to convey their stories about how they are helping themselves, because as we all know, it's aid agencies come second. It's communities and individuals who help themselves first through conflicts and crises. So some of our advocacy goals. I mean, we are journalists, so we have, we are advocates to the degree of as communicators. But we do share we support some of Watch's advocacy goals, which are to try to cover neglected crises and conflicts, or issues or groups within them, or well-covered crises that have been neglected. We try to look at early warning on conflict and natural disaster, and we try to look at the before and the after. So in a situation like Mali, where a lot of reporters went in when there was a coup, when militants took over and rebel groups took over the north, and when the French forces intervened in January earlier this year, we are still there. We're still there looking at the ongoing problems of returns of displaced people who don't want to return, the need for a national reconciliation and dialogue, the need to rebuild fragile state structures. So that's our role, is to kind of be there when everyone else has gone home, all the other journalists have gone home. And finally, we aim to go behind the news to explain the why rather than just the what. I think journalists are faced with extreme time pressure, having to do real-time reporting, and thus a lot of them don't have that ability to step back and look at the why. So just to give some context, according to a 2012 study, media organizations had the lowest number of foreign correspondents in 21 years. With some notable exceptions, such as the New York Times. For us, we have 167 correspondents who are our eyes and ears, and they really are our legitimacy. Without them, we are nothing. They're in Kano, in northern Nigeria, they're in Goma, they're in Damascus, and they are the ones who are telling us, the reality of what's going on the ground. I'll just give an example. Oops, I've forgotten all my slides. Okay, so just to take an example, this is a battered building in northern Yemen. Yemen is a relatively low-profile country for international news. It's the poorest country in the Middle East. Nearly half of its population is food insecure. 1/3 of its children are acutely malnourished, which is it's twice the emergency threshold, as delineated by WHO. Reporters don't really cover humanitarian news in Yemen, and that's where we try to fill that gap. So we try to sort of cover the hidden issues that others aren't necessarily excited about. I'm just going to quickly move on to Syria, which is obviously a very well-reported crisis. It's in the news every day, but the media frame is very much, it focuses on international diplomacy, the latest developments about, regarding fighting and the control of territory, and the whole chemical weapons issue. They've paid less attention to the humanitarian impact of the crisis on people's day-to-day lives. So some of the issues that we've tried to look at are, for instance, the internally displaced people, as opposed to the refugees. The internally displaced people are even less covered in terms of aid, and have slightly been neglected in terms of coverage. The neglected needs of elderly refugees, how people with chronic diseases are accessing their medication. People with diabetes, how are they getting their diabetes meds? The impact of the crisis on farmers and agricultural production. Palestinian refugees who are refugees in Syria and now are refugees again in Lebanon, so starting again as refugees. So just to give you an example. We've also tried to critically analyze, what's currently the largest humanitarian aid response going on in the world. We see it. We do try to play a watchdog role for the $17.9 billion a year aid industry, humanitarian sector. And I'll go into that in a second. I don't know how much time I have. Halfway through?
4 minutes.
Okay, fine, I'm going to cut that. Okay. Well, I'll just mention it very quickly. So, this is a series of films we did on the Kenya elections, just in terms of looking at analysis and going behind the news. So, the Kenyan, there was, there was violence that broke out after the 2007 and 2008 elections in Kenya. And that was very much framed as ethnic violence by the mainstream media. And we tried to reframe it and look at the real issues that were driving that violence, which was really about economic inequity, above all. And again, 2013, we did the same thing. We tried to look at actually what are these elections about? Everyone was talking about Kenya braces for another bloody election battle. And we were looking at, well, actually it's about power, it was about devolution of power from the center to the counties and economic issues. So how do we do this? I'll just very quickly look at, how are we able to do this? One is our Stringer network. Secondly is funding. We've been very lucky to have UN funding for 18 years. So that's given us, we don't have to pander to commercial interests. We don't have to worry too much about audience numbers. We can write about pastoralists, and if only a few people are reading it, we can carry on doing that. So, that's a huge luxury in the media world. We are not reporting on daily news, so we don't have that time pressure. We can, sort of step back and analyze. In terms of our impact, I would say, our goal is to inform, provoke questions and debates, and try to also watchdog the aid industry. We don't sort of have scientific advocacy objectives, that I used to try to come up with when I was at Save the Children. And in that sense, I think a lot of our work is picked up by the other news agencies. We syndicate a lot of copy. We see a lot of our themes taken up by the BBC, for instance. So that's just a way in which we're sort of reaching a wider audience and in which we try to get our messages across. But it's not scientific, and we're not measuring it scientifically. Okay, so, but of course, I'll just quickly go into the challenges and then look at the role of technology. So, of course, there's lots of challenges inherent in that. The main one for us is access, as has been mentioned. Accessing a lot of these places, northeastern Nigeria, northern Yemen, is really difficult for both international and national reporters. And so how do you get that quality of information when you can't go there? So a lot of our reporting, we struggle with this, and I'll look at how we've turned to technology to deal with it. Likewise, government bureaucracy also blocks our access. I've been trying to get to Mauritania for 6 months to the refugee camp. It's the government keeps on blocking it. I would say, another sort of ongoing challenge for us is portraying people's difficult situations without putting them in danger. I interviewed a homosexual in Cameroon a week ago, and trying to figure out how to portray his story without putting him in any more of a dangerous situation. Interviewing children. A lot of these things that we do, we have to follow very strict guidelines. And for instance, with children, we would follow UNICEF's child protection guidelines for documenting children to try and guide us. Lastly, looking at, within this sort of, and there's lots of others, but I'm running out of time. So look, how does technology fit into this rubric for us? Well, some simple things. Skype has proved an invaluable way for us to reach people in areas that are under siege or cut off that we would ordinarily not necessarily be able to reach. So for instance, in Syria, in areas under siege, we've been able to interview people over Skype. But I would say generally Twitter, blogging, microblogging, social media, for us it really just adds to the stream of information. It makes contacts more easily accessible, and often very high-level contacts, for instance, parliamentarians in the Philippines. It gives us access to reports that otherwise smaller organizations are putting out that otherwise we might not be able to access. Twitter, of course, can also give us a minute-by-minute account of disaster response and the situation for disaster-affected people in some countries, or in some situations. But I would say that we have to be, step back and analyze what's going, there's a lot of information out there, and we really need to be, as journalists, very, very careful about verifying the accuracy of that information. There's a whole lot of work, a lot of interesting programs going on right now about sort of looking at accuracy and analysis, rather than just taking it hook, line, and sinker. And just to bring up the Syria example, the way in which some international journalists have used social media in Syria is really problematic by interviewing people that they've never met via Skype, or replaying videos taken on mobile phones and in places they've never visited and cannot verify, and just reproducing them on their websites. So this brings up difficult questions of reliability and objectivity of information, and we would only use those types of materials if we could very carefully cross-check them. So I think, because I'm running out of time, so I would just say, for IRIN, to some degree, we're very excited about this new technology, and I could go into it further, but to some degree, the old rules of reporting hold true, which is, let survivors tell their own stories, and for every allegation, provide the chance of a rebuttal and or an explanation. Thank you.
Hi. Excuse me. So I'd like to focus on what I describe as the opportunities and challenges of citizen witnessing for human rights. Let me explain a little more about that. So Witness, the organization I work for, was founded just over 20 years ago in the aftermath of what I think of as a quintessential act of citizen witnessing for human rights. This was an act that took place in LA. It was the witnessing by a man, George Holliday, of the beating of Rodney King. Started a whole trajectory of action around racial discrimination, police violence in LA, but also in the US, and a global debate. And for the past 20 years, Witness has worked supporting people to use video in their activism, in their advocacy. And Alison, as you described the model that you've been articulating through all these case studies, it resonated very strongly with the model we have of video advocacy that is very audience-driven, that thinks about narratives for audience, that thinks about safety, security, and consent, and how something is framed within a broader campaign. And we've worked with groups in around 90 countries, thinking about how that's done in context from community work to lobbying to decision makers to evidence. But actually the part I want to focus on is something slightly different. And it's kind of the looping back to that citizen witnessing moment. And this is a part of Witness's work that I'm very focused on at the moment. And I think this slide kind of captures something of that. So Kony 2012, this is a grab from a YouTube publicity slide. Left-hand side, Kony 2012, a human rights video. I think I have a slightly different perspective on it from Alison, but I think the thing that's important in this one is that it's an aberration video in terms of viewership, in terms of how many people see it. Eventually 100 million people saw that video. Most human rights video gets 20 views, 200 views, 1,000 views. It's in that category on the right-hand side of the screen, the 100 hours a minute that get uploaded to YouTube. So think in those terms, in terms of what I'm going to be speaking about. And so I often think about this in terms of kind of a citizen witnessing moment, and I'll tell you some of the symptoms of that. Does anyone want to guess how many videos were uploaded last year or in the past year and a half to YouTube that show potential war crimes in Syria? I don't want to take a guess. Go on. Yeah. 800. Anyone else want to give another one? 1,000. Okay, way higher, guys. You're way too lowballing it. Okay, still way lowballing. Okay, 500,000. Now, when you look at that amount of volume, it changes the perception you have about where media fits. Today, does anyone know where there are live videos coming from a major city that can show you police brutality occurring right now? Chicago. Brazil, right now. Live videos, live streaming from the streets. So this is what I'm thinking about as we talk about this kind of citizen witnessing moment. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities and the challenges. And they're kind of wound together in what we see. And I'm going to talk about 5. The first one is this one. How do you get skills to more people, more diverse range of people, more rapidly? Because the old categories of who documents human rights, who makes videos, don't exist. People who made them in Syria, those people did not expect to be human rights activists 2 years ago. They did not expect to be filmmakers 6 months ago. The person who picks up a camera in the aftermath of an incident in their community because it's on their mobile device doesn't expect to be a human rights activist. And they haven't had the training we've all received. So you have this major challenge. It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. When you have millions of people who potentially want to document human rights and could do it in a way that contributes to these value chains of documentation and advocacy and solidarity building we've been describing. These are some of the things that activists say to us when we talk to them about things they want to know about. And I'm happy to talk more with people about how we train on this or also look at the Witness website in terms of options there. Second area which comes up is privacy, safety and consent. And again, this is about the explosion of old norms. Now, before, if you're a human rights activist, before you interviewed someone, you went through a very detailed consent process, rightly, right? We developed those processes because they protect people. Those rules are not being observed by 99% of the people out there. They don't know them, they don't understand them, they don't relate to them. Now, why is this important? Because it's very easy to be targeted when you're identified and seen in social media. This is a very graphic illustration of it. It's from a Iranian militia site after the Green Revolution, picking out photos from YouTube and Flickr, sticking them online. I actually think this is a bit of a red herring. I think it's far more important to think about someone like this lady in Zimbabwe, speaking out in the aftermath of the election violence, and she knew that in order to compete in our information ecosystem now, she had to create photos, shoot videos, put them out there, that was the way her story would have currency. But how is she going to do that and protect herself at the same time? I want to talk a little bit about a way we approach that, and it's by thinking about how you give people tools. And I don't want to fetishize tools. I'm wearing a tool on my face, but I don't want to fetishize the idea of tools. I want you to think about the purpose they serve and who they serve. So one of the biggest problems, if you're someone trying to give an interview and a testimony and you're not a filmmaker or an activist, is actually, how do I blur someone's face? You know, I've just filmed this, I've got it on my mobile phone. Does any of you know how to blur your face on the mobile phone? Okay, so if you wanted to upload that testimony, what would you do? You would say, and this is in Syria, oh my God, I've got to get this up there quickly. Can I take that risk? Can I take that risk for this person? So we approach this one way, and this is one way to think about it. We helped build a tool that you could put on your mobile phone that could blur faces, and then you could upload the footage. And then the second thing we did, and this relates to another thing that I think is really important as you think about the ecosystem of media creation now, is that the real power players here are not the human rights groups. They are people like YouTube and Google and Facebook who decide and make decisions on platforms where we share the footage. So one thing we did, and I think it's a strategy more human rights groups should be doing, is we advocated to YouTube about building in a blurring function on YouTube, which hopefully will serve many people, but it will serve our constituency even more so. Another area, trust in this huge volume of information. Again, goes back to that 500 million videos. And I totally appreciate Anna's point about verification. Such a huge challenge when you have this much volume. And I think one of the things you want to do is give a head start to people who can turn single items of documentation into more information. One project we work on is a human rights channel on YouTube. It's kind of the designated space for human rights footage in YouTube. And we work with news gathering organizations to try and verify, contextualize as human rights footage, not just mindless violence or people complaining, which is honestly what a lot of people think human rights video is about, if they watch it without context, into information that can be utilized by people who will then turn it into something else in the value chain. So that could be around war crimes in Syria, which ones were apparent, which ones were alleged, which ones were falsified, or it could be about any number of events that have taken place over the past 2 years. We also think about the tools side there. I won't go into great depth on that, but we build tools, again, built into things like mobile phones to enable you to add the data that will make something more easy to prove. The types of data about who shot it, the context, who can corroborate it. Again, because most of the documentation now that we see happens on a mobile device. And that is both powerful and a weakness. It's powerful because this can add data. It's a weakness because this can add data. So you want to give people control to say, I want to give a heads up, a leg up to someone who is going to try and analyze this so they can work out who it came from, how to trust it, all of those questions. We do that using a tool called Informacam that was built with a group called the Guardian Project, which I won't go into technical details, but when you choose to, it puts in this data that says this was shot here by this camera, these are the corroborating sources around you, and this is how you know it hasn't been tampered with. And then you share it to someone you trust. And again, we're advocating to YouTube to see if they'll build something similar into their platform, because they're the powerful unseen actors. Facebook, YouTube, Google, and of course, behind that, the telco companies and government policy. And I want to end on just one final note, and again, it goes to the Google Glass. And I'm wearing this partly because I want to hear what you think human rights activists should be doing with something like this, but also the human rights values that are at stake with something like this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project I've just been working on, But I want to make this statement first, which is, I think, the kind of the digital divide as expressed by cyberpunk authors, which is William Gibson, author of Neuromancer, said, "The future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed yet." So yes, I've got Google Glass, but in Central African Republic, they don't have Google Glass, and they probably won't for a few more years. So I want to talk just 1 minute on the project that I've been working on the last summer. It's at a place called the Institute for the Future, so take this with a grain of futurism salt. But I think it's important to think about where things move and to get ahead of that, because we're a small community. Although we're growing, and I know you're all training to be human rights advocates, we're still small on a global scale in comparison to so many other communities. And the problem I'm trying to address here is this question of two things. How do we develop empathy and compassion for others? And how do we translate that into action? Because all too often, and this is a clip from a video that I worked on, this is how people feel at the other end of global solidarity activism. The clip here, this is a woman in Macedonia, a sex worker, and her quote was, "The well-fed never believe the hungry." So this goal of communication transnationally, tremendously challenging. So I'm working on the combination of three factors. One is the ability more and more to show what's happening, on our mobile phones and to show it live. Okay? This ability to show live what's happening in many different places. And then I'm adding to that this idea of how do you think about the idea of co-presence? That's the feeling you're with someone. Now, you'll all have experienced this, but you may not know it. It's the feeling you have when you're in a great Skype call, when you're looking at your Instagram feed, and you're there and you're going, wow, I really know what it's like in my friend's life, even though I haven't seen them in years. And it's the same feeling you get if you watch an Occupy protest. Anyone watch the Occupy protests? You could watch what happened in Zuccotti Park. It felt like you were there. What is that feeling of being there? How do we use that? I think the human rights community needs to think about this, because there are millions of people watching things live around the world, and they're mainly doing what I think Alison described as, or I think it was Joel, as gawking and voyeurism. So how do we turn that into action? And one thing we might want to look at is actually this. And this comes out of a completely different sector of our world. It's called task routing. It's what you do when, for example, Google Now on your phone tells you it might be time to go to a restaurant. It's when in the crisis mapping community, which works in humanitarian affairs, someone reaches out to you and says, you could help verify this. It's things like that. So if we think about that ability to combine watching something live and turning that into real actions that are timely and relevant and about our skills, we could think of a very different way of structuring global solidarity that's more than about gawking. It's more than about watching. It's more than about signing a change.org petition. So I'm going to leave that as a finishing point here of where we might want to think about live video, of media, and of action as we move forward. And it's about these kinds of scenarios. Rapid action, analysis, and leverage as we are part of a protest in St. Petersburg for LGBT rights. It's about walking in the shoes of an LGBT community in Uganda, sharing joy as a mode of building solidarity. And it's about this, maybe, the idea that anyone who's ever in a land dispute could have a legal observer on their shoulder who is on call, who can look through their eyes, can give advice when it matters. Now, this is 2 or 3 or 5 years out, but we should be imagining these possibilities as we think about a global solidarity movement for human rights that respects the local, but brings us all in really meaningful ways that support that. So I'm going to end there.
So, as Joel's mentioned, I work for Doctors Without Borders. We're known internationally as Médecins Sans Frontières. I'm going to probably use the acronym MSF often, so just not to confuse anyone. One of the reasons I sort of agreed to come to this conference, even though it is a human rights conference, and I think there are important and significant differences between the work of human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations, is to sort of show some of those differences and also show some of the possible complementarities of that. So I'm coming at this not from a human rights perspective, but looking at it from the perspective of humanitarian action. And as an organization, MSF is very much focused on providing aid to victims of war and other disasters, epidemics, HIV/AIDS, malnutrition, and so forth. And this is really a space, particularly in conflict zones, where the ideas of sort of theories and principles very violently collide with the realities of operating environments where you have to negotiate with arguably human rights abusers, to reach people, to provide them aid, and convince them of your motives and what are your motives. And so I look at this in many ways and sometimes I have to. It's a necessity to look at these issues from a different lens in some ways. That doesn't mean that humanitarian organizations shouldn't be in the act and the process of sort of constantly reflecting on the compromises that they have to make to operate in these environments. And it's something that I think while we are very much a field-based organization, we have tried and institutionalized the ideas of reflection. We have an internal think tank. It is people who are basically some of our most experienced practitioners of the work that we do, and their job is to question those compromises that we have to make, where the ideas of principles of impartiality and independence sort of collide with the reality of trying to get across the front line, provide aid to people, and also navigating the ideas of that saving some lives is also about letting others die sometimes, and that is a very difficult political environment to operate in. So keeping with that notion, I wasn't quite sure if it would be launched yet, but thankfully it has been. We're actually sort of opening up the archive to real primary source information about our experience in some of the most difficult environments that we've worked in. It is a website called speakingout.msf.org. It's just opened up in the last few days. I would encourage you to go. We have done a number of sort of institutional memory processes around Rwanda, North Korea, Chechnya, Congo, other places that we've worked. Somalia, I think Alex, I'm not sure if he's here anymore, but talked about sort of his reasons for leaving Human Rights Watch. Well, there is a whole new book that we've just published on the 92 to 93 period in Somalia. So that's sort of in the spirit of this idea of being able to sort of be in a constant state of reflection while still doing and carrying out your work. So I look at communication, and my job daily is to look at communication really through the idea of how is it sort of, it's not an end to itself, right? The work that my colleagues do is practicing medicine, providing assistance to people, providing them food, treating malnourished children, and so forth. And so our communication, when we choose to speak out, and this is very difficult because you don't always know the benefits or the costs of doing something like that, is really a means to improving our access to our patients and also to providing assistance, improving that. So this is sort of the space that I operate in. Saying all that, one of the key things to being able to operate in these environments is what, in the vernacular of sort of my organization and others, is this notion of building acceptance. The fact that you must negotiate with people who, like I said, they may be human rights abusers in the context. They control power. They hold a somewhat, sometimes tenuous, but sometimes strong monopoly on violence in the places that you operate. And really, one of the key principles of getting that access for us is maintaining this notion of impartiality, right? That we will treat anyone from all sides. So we will tell a commander in a village and say, look, you can bring your wounded soldier in here from the battlefield, just don't bring in your weapons, we'll treat you. We'll ask that we treat you based on the prioritization of need. If there's someone else with a more serious medical condition, we're gonna treat them first. And that's an idea, and a very important one, that is absolutely critical for us having the ambulances that cross the front lines every day in Eastern Congo. They provide assistance on both sides of the fighting. Because of that purity of motive and something that we have to be very conscious of. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because right now, there's 30,000 of my colleagues operating in 70 countries. Some of them are incredibly volatile. Syria, Eastern Congo, Central African Republic, just to name a few. Our risk exposure is very significant. And that's why oftentimes we do run into some tiffs with human rights organizations, although we work very oftentimes with them in the field, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and others. It's because of that risk profile and making sure that there is a clarity and understanding of our motives. We're not there to document the abuses, although we will speak out about them. And that book, those books that I'm alluding to, are really about that situation-based ethics of how you navigate those things in real time and the choices you make. So just bring in the idea of technology, communication technology, social media. MSF has a long history of working with photojournalists, documentary filmmaking. This goes back 80s. We've had photographers embedded with us in places like in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. It goes back, and we've tried to be a relatively savvy at leveraging some of the new and emerging technologies. Whether it was, when bloggings were in vogue, just using this as a way, as a bridge between the the people who support us and the day-to-day reality of the people who work for us in the field, creating that sort of bridge. In other cases where we've used things like Twitter to put pressure on the U.S. government to try and reform its policies around the quality of food aid. This was the Starve for Attention project that Joel was alluding to in my introduction. We've also used it to put pressure on the government and the U.S. government to secure landing rights after the earthquake in Haiti. So just very practical, concrete things. And sort of trying to look at these tools in the sense of trying to evaluate what do they bring to the table? How do they add the ability to provide assistance, to change policy, to improve access to medicine? We've gone after pharmaceutical companies about their policies on intellectual property rights because they have very serious implications for access to medicines for our HIV patients. We've used Facebook. We've actually used the Facebook advertising targeting to make sure that the employees of those companies will see our advocacy messages, because we've heard and understood through our networking that is important. You understand influence, right? It's something that I think Alison's talking about. Who is your audience? Who you're trying to influence? That can change radically from context to country to country, non-state actor to state actor companies, as some of the people have alluded to. The point is that we've tried to be savvy in that regard. We've used GPS-based mapping to map out the presence of cholera cases in Haiti to try and identify sources of infection. We've used these things. I think there's been a number of things that have been talked about with crisis mappers and other organizations like that. One of the tricky things, though, and I think the sort of other side to these technologies that we've seen recently, is in that sort of back to the idea of this sort of negotiating access, right? I have people that I work with, they are phenomenally good at negotiating with tough customers. They understand hierarchy. For those of you who were here last night, those very interesting sort of networking maps that Alex showed us, right? Those maps are very interesting. They're about power, connections. My teams on the ground, they have to understand those structures in order to sort of navigate, know if a road is safe. Very practical, on-the-ground things, understanding that. Understanding who is influential in these spaces. Social media has totally changed that, and I'll give you a couple practical examples, right? While, my colleagues might know which commander to call up to go to a certain area from a certain rebel group, it is very difficult to discern this idea of who's influential when you come into social media space. Just to give you some practical examples, we've been working for many years in Myanmar. One of the areas that we work in, and largely because they're a neglected minority, discriminated against, you could say, a stateless group, the Rohingya, the Muslim community, right? Many of them, I'm sure, are aware of the kinds of things that have happened in Rakhine State over the past few years. We have been assisting the Rohingya in Bangladesh as well as in Rakhine State in Myanmar. Very practically, one of the things that have opening up Myanmar that has come in recent years is the availability of things like Facebook. It has become a primary, means of communication, even faster and more reliable than accessing kind of some of the more sort of exile, traditional sort of news outlets. It's also the space where this notion of my organization trying to preserve its perception, its impartiality. I mean, we provide assistance to both Rohingya, the Muslim community, and also offer aid and treat AIDS patients in the Buddhist community, right? Where there's been these clashes. Facebook has been used to put images of where our staff live, the times that they come and go from the house, when they are on the road, and to use it as a tool to advocate violence against those staff. It has become a mechanism for that, and that's where I think it's very interesting what Sam is saying about the place of these entities, right? With the Googles, the Twitters, the Facebook, the YouTube. How do you think about their responsibility for the space that they're creating, right? Because they are publishers, even though they don't think they are. And so, how do you combat that? So very quickly, I think one of the very practical challenges is that understanding who is influential in these spaces and who do we need to care about? Because I have staff in Yangon and other places in Syria who are running around trying to put out fires because they don't really know, and we don't really have the tools to evaluate in these spaces who is influential. to what Alison was saying, I think there's actually a fundamental break between the notion of expertise and influence in these spaces, right? The fact that we can talk to diplomats, we can talk to other people, elites in these countries, and we can shape that. But we don't really know who's behind and what their motives are in these spaces. And they pose very serious dangers to my colleagues on the ground. And I'll be totally frank, I mean, while the center here will be working on a lot of different issues in the human rights vein, figuring out the tools to evaluate those risks is something that was what keeps me up at night, because it's the things I'm most worried about. The way we could use those tools to shake things up in Washington on food aid policy, great. These are the things I'm most concerned about in terms of the evolution of technology.
I'm going to turn the floor over to you all. There are some microphones around if someone can help. So, open for questions.
Hi, my name is Virginia Dixon. I'm with Open Society Foundations. This question is directed towards Sam or anyone else who would like to jump in. A lot of times when we're talking about media and human rights, we have a lot of discussion over what action the spectator is going to take. I'm wondering if you can talk at all about any kind of political agency that has been afforded to someone who witness has given a camera, say like a woman or a person of color, anyone of a marginalized community, how their life was changed when they were able to take a photograph or to take a video. And I guess in a related question, a lot of times, I would say the model is that a political agenda is set, and that's where CNN will take their coverage. Not any of these other kind of organizations, but I'm talking about like mass media. So political agenda is set, and that's where the cameras go. Has your kind of model with witness, have any of the people who have been given a camera, do you see, if you can give an example of a time when a local advocate was able to set the political agenda rather than a top-down model, bottom-up sort of thing, if that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Let's take a couple more, we'll collect them.
Hello, my name is Shana Plowd, and I work with human rights journalism. And one of the things that I'm often concerned about is one of the things that I'm often concerned about is the idea of the media as kind of an amorphous entity. And I want to talk about journalists, and I want to talk about what kind of education do journalists need in order to accurately cover human rights issues, a basic literacy in journalists. And should this be a specific field like human rights journalism, or should all journalists be trained in a basic literacy so that they can approach issues within a human rights frame? And also to know the various techniques and concerns, for instance, what Jason was saying, when covering issues, in order to do it in a way that keeps in mind the human rights of those who are being covered.
Hello, thank you for presentations. Alil Hindi from Notre Dame University. I don't have a clear position on that, just a comment and welcome your feedback, probably mostly related to what Sam was saying. Are we giving citizen journalism a bit too much of a leverage? Because these people who are shooting these videos, they don't care about the human rights. They don't even know human rights, some of them at least, or many of them. Because the same way they take photos of a massacre and condemn it, they hail for their own killing of their own enemy. And something that really incited me to speak about that is, for example, those who took pictures of Tahrir Square and those who revolted against Mubarak. At the same time, they did not do anything to stop a girl being raped and videoed inside Tahrir Square. So how do we think about showing violence altogether, and what kind of result would that have on the public? And instead of having, for example, 2 local channels swearing at each other and inciting people on violence, now we have 2 million videos inciting on violence. So I don't know just some ideas. I would welcome your feedback, especially from Sam. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone care to get us started?
Sam's the man.
I'll respond to that. I think there's three things I would say about this. One is I come from a very pragmatic point of view that people are going to do it. You know, I don't want to describe it as a human impulse, but people will record things that are happening around them. And I think it's important to recognize there's a real range across that. I'm using Syria as a very dramatic example, but on the Human Rights Channel, we've seen citizen journalism that comes out of people documenting issues around structural issues in their communities, where it's not like the first day they're documenting, you know, a killing they do, and the next day they're documenting something else that's, you know, equally violent, that they don't see the blame attached to it or the culpability. So I think Syria is a very extreme case there, but also I start from the assumption that people will do it. I think there's a platform role there actually in helping people think about the role of ethics and consent in the way we help people use platforms. The second, and this is, I think, hard, and I think it applies in the journalism world as well. In journalism, people often talk about the transition from journalism to acts of journalism, which is kind of an uncomfortable transition, and I know people don't like it, and I could see someone who really doesn't like it sitting there. But it's the truth. Like, there are people who will document pieces, and they perceive that they're doing a journalistic act. I think it is actually a good way to frame it, is actually to think of them as citizen witnesses. It's the reason why we use that frame. A lot of the time they don't think of themselves as journalists. They think of themselves as people who are documenting something that has importance and they want to have shared. But I think in the same way in human rights, you do have people who document acts of human rights documentation, and they may not do it again in 3 months' time, and they may not do it on the same set of principles across every issue. That doesn't mean they're not going to do it, and so I think we have to grapple a little bit with that concept. I think the role of human rights groups in curating and contextualizing and using documentation, and much like journalists also saying, wait a second, let's counter this one, is really important. So I'm not de-emphasizing that, I'm just saying, let's think about that role. I'll respond very briefly to Virginia, to your questions. I want to make sure there's space for others on the panel as well. I certainly think there's agency in the act of creating media. Again, I tend to think the real feeling of agency comes when that media has impact. So particularly in the human rights realm, like certainly from an ideological perspective, I tend to prioritize helping people translate media interaction rather than literally just the act of media creation as having value. There are clearly others who prioritize both. And I think the second question is, how do you then give those direct people and then the second order witnesses, the people who watch that agency, to turn it into action? I'll give you two very quick examples from our own experience working with local activists in the DRC, looking at how they might push particular issues around what's happening with child soldiers in the lead up to the first ICC trial. There, my colleagues at a group called Ajedi Ka were trying to promote that. I won't go into the details, but I think the reason that they were somewhat successful in getting their visual media used was exactly towards the reasons that Alison describes, that they thought about alliances, they exerted the same kinds of leverage politics that we know work out. They thought about, how it was framed within a broader campaign. Those have been consistent factors for us when we've seen local advocates succeed in longer term campaigns. And then I think a second role, which goes to the second order witnesses, is to look out for people who step into curator roles and leverage that. I think about people like Mehdi Sahakiz from the Iranian Green Revolution, who took 3,000 items of media and kind of helped make sense of it in a slightly different context. Someone like Brown Moses in the Syria context, who is a person who looks at stuff and sorts it through and helps people sort the wheat from the chaff amongst hundreds of videos. So I think there's both agency there directly when you film it, but there's also agency in the kind of second order that we should be paying a lot of attention to.
I'd like to jump in on that point, and I'd like to kind of respond to Victoria's question, a bit of a challenge to the question, because I think we tend perhaps from an overly academic perspective on agency versus spectators to artificially divide that process, and it's really not it's an integrated process. And I started thinking about some of these questions literally 20 years ago in the mid-90s in the jungle in Ecuador, in the Amazon, working with indigenous groups who had cameras and were beginning to use those both to launch strategic appeals and to document their own lives, and there was a process of empowerment, and people used those tools to transform their lives and their communities and their roles within their communities. So it's really, and that was 20 years ago. If you look at something like, the Born in Brothels project, in the documentary Born in Brothels, and the work that's been done with the children of sex workers and with sex workers and with trafficked women, there's, again, a very integrated process. So even though I provide this kind of academic analysis, I think it's important for us to recognize that on the ground, agency and empowerment is a spectrum and a dialectic, and we're all agents and we're all witnesses and we're all spectators at the same time. And trying to facilitate and improve that process is more important than sort of slicing it.
That's okay, we're just sorry. Anybody else going to jump in?
You go first.
I mean, just looking at the citizen journalism question. I mean, I'm taking it from a slightly different perspective, which is a lot. Some of the platforms that have opened up for a much more interactive exchange between, say, humanitarian agencies and disaster-affected populations. And that's kind of they're taking it in there. They're using these tools to document what's happening to them and the kind of aid responses they're getting. And too often the aid responses are falling incredibly short. And for quite a while now, there's been this whole debate about how to improve aid effectiveness. And people were getting feedback from through these new tools, but weren't doing anything about it. I mean, aid agencies weren't doing anything about it. Now with this, now that they have more agency to actually, to publicly say this is what this such and such aid agency did not deliver, et cetera, they're forcing aid agencies to be more accountable. So that's just a sort of sideways response to how that actually can leverage much more accountability. And just in terms of the education question, I mean, we were talking about it this morning. To me, there's a huge lack of it. And I don't know whether it's a question of integrating it into mainstream training programs or it's having specific trainings, but certainly, in West Africa where I work, I mean, we work with journalists who've had, pretty shoddy journalism training in some countries in the first place, so even the very basics of, sourcing and questioning things are not incorporated in their training. So, we're starting at a very low baseline in some places, but absolutely I would think there was a huge appetite for it, especially with all these tools coming on board.
Just as far as photojournalism, there are some programs at NYU's training photographers in that, because they're photojournalists, and I think there's a real deficit in the training because they're parachute journalism. They're going to go in there, they're going to see it. They're not trained like that guy that was in Syria that was a freelancer, that it was his first time a photographer, and he was captured, and kept for how long? I mean, if he had training, that might not have happened. And so I've been trying to advocate a lot of I've been teaching human rights and human rights framework in photography programs, but it's a struggle. I mean, they want to just learn a lot about technique, and don't want to learn about that, but yet they want to be photojournalists. So I'm teaching this year at International Center for Photography, how to photojournalism and human rights, how to be a good photographer, and hopefully, they'll get some of those good practices in there within the training and an understanding of the scope of human rights, because I really do think it's important.
Well, that'll just about do it for us.
That wraps it up.
We're done.
So please first join me in thanking all of our excellent speakers.
Well, yeah, it's been 2 incredible days, 2.5 days with a concert and everything like that, and I just want to, on behalf of the president, the provost, everyone, the strategic planning group for the center, everyone really at the university community, thank you all for coming. We had high hopes for this conference. I think it exceeded it. I know I learned a great deal. I want to thank a couple people. First of all, I want to thank Peter McGrath, who's made this possible in many respects. Paula Sedaris, who did much of the logistics, and all the people behind her. all my colleagues, Jason Pierce on the strategic planning group, but most of all, Joel, who not only organized this, which is why it's come off without a hitch, it wasn't me, but conceptualized it. So, Joel, thank you very much. This is the beginning. We're launching Human Rights Center. Its mission is advocacy, research, education, dialogue. We'll be doing this again. This is the beginning of a process, the beginning of a dialogue. We'll have you back in 2 years, and even if you can't, you'll be hearing from us, and we want to hear from you. Thank you again. There's a reception soon. I found this incredibly worthwhile. I hope you did as well. But, you know, we have work to do. But first we'll have the reception, and then we'll have work to do. Thank you, everyone.